We're studying the Aggadeta here on Daf Nunamid Beis that begins with the third of the wide lines, Tan Rabbanan, and this is the Aggadeta of Eno Roes Simon Bracha, which means that there's certain kinds of occupations that Chazal classified as occupations which are not really worthwhile. It's not something that a Jew should be excited about. Perhaps we'll get a chance later to discuss the Beis Yosef. The Beis Yosef vacillates about this whole sugya, whether Eino Roa Siman Bracha is the same as saying that it's osur, it's prohibited, or more likely, Eino Roa Siman Bracha means that it's not ratsui, it's not something that we should recommend. And the last Gemara that we learned yesterday, which was the last of the thin lines, Tanur Rabbanan, that Brisa spoke about what occupation a person should be happy that his wife is involved into making money, and what occupation is he not happy about. And we came to the conclusion, based on a pasuk in Eshes Chayil, it says, Sadin Asasav Atimkar, Vachagar Nasno Laknani, and the pasuk is praising a woman who manufactures clothing, in this case, and she hires a Knani. The word Knani here means a socher, a middleman, to take those begadim that she created, that she wove, and sell them on the open market. It's apparently a very lucrative business, and she doesn't have to lower herself to go out to the shuk and peddle, very limited in terms of the worth wares, but rather she's really proud to be manufacturing beautiful woven clothing, and then somebody will sell it for her on the open market. Maybe he'll split the profit with her. And that's something that'll be a Simon Bracha. But if a man has to support himself by sending his wife out to the market, and the Gemara has the example of renting out small little scales that the sochrim in the market need in order to convince the buyer that they're getting the right price for the right volume or the right weight. So she rents out these scales and she makes a little pittance, and she has to run around from one seller to another to try to rent out this scale. And she makes such a little, the profit margin is so limited. That's not a Simon Brach. Again, I think in the Beis Yosef's framework, we have to know whether or not this is something that should be prohibited. Obviously, the prime financial sustainer of the family is the husband. And in this case, for whatever reason, he's relying on his wife, and she's not really making that much, but she's in a sense lowering herself to have to run around in the shuk for such a small pittance. I'm not sure if the Gemara has in the back of its mind a different pasuk in Mishlei about kol kvoda basvel prima, about tznius. I can't tell you one way or the other. Tanur Rabbanan, another kind of occupation that the profits of which, the intake of which, is not subject to what we call a Simon Bracha. Hamistaker bekonim, and we're talking about someone who is selling vertical poles, and these poles, these are maklos or konim that are used to make fences. I think we had something similar in Masechet Eruvin, those vertical fences. And bekankanim, or he sells earthenware vessels. Eino roa siman brach liola. I mean, what's the problem with this occupation? Seems like a clean livelihood. My timer, says the Gemara, kevan de nafish af chazarayu shalta behu ena. Now, if we start backwards, as if to say, I understand what Sholta Ba'ena means, we understand what Sholta Ba'ena means, and there's some sort of an ayin hara over here. And certain occupations can actually generate an ayin hara. And therefore, Einam Siman Broch. Now, what is it about selling these poles or selling these earthenware vessels that would generate an ayin hara? So the Gemara says, the nafesh af chazarayu. And the translation of that last word, af chazarayu, is nofach. Nofach means the physical material takes up space. You know, it's got a certain volume to it. It's kind of loud, if you will. What do I mean by loud? Rashi explains that people know about it. It's kind of wares that are bombastic in their size. In the footnote here, he quotes Tosfos Chachmei Anglia, and I'm not sure if they add anything here, but for our purposes, but I'll read it to you. He says, Tmeim Alehem Ha'olam, like the spectators, the people out there watching this person sell these bombastic large wares, Atmeim Alehem, they are amazed by them. The Omrim, and they point and they say, Ru'u Ploni Bamemistaker. Take a look at this person who's really making a crash. He's making a lot of success. Shemidavar Sheino Klum, he takes earth from the ground, and again, there's a whole science here, a whole profession, how to take the earth and make it into, a final piece of pottery. I wouldn't know how to do that. I mean, unless I went to one of these, they have these places where they show you how to make ceramics. You pay for it. It's for the young people. It's a nice place to take a date. There's one in Yerushalayim. I remember there was one in Toronto. He says, "Midavar sheino klum osa kelim sheshovim kol kach." He starts with the dirt on the ground, and he sells his wares for 50. He made a tremendous margin of profit. And it's quite obvious that he's doing so. So he cuts down a tree, and he takes the wood of the tree and strips the wood and prepares them. He goes through a lot of work. It's a lumber yard, and he produces kanim and kankanim and all this production. It's almost antithetical to what we learned before about the women folk. In the case of the women folk, we are praising the women because what's the pasuk? Sadin asasav atimkar. She takes threads and produces some beautiful woven tapestry or clothing, and she sells them through this knani. And that's wonderful. That's a siman brach because of her, in a sense, productivity, her creative work. Taking something that sells for nothing, a couple of strands of wool, and she makes them into threads, etc., etc., beautiful with colors and this, that, and the other thing, and she sells it at a profit. And that's a great thing. That's a siman bracha. But somehow when we get to the men folk, and they're out there, selling things at a decent, hopefully an honest price, a good price, and they started with raw materials that were worth almost nothing, all of a sudden we're worried about ayin hara. And I'm not sure, is there more of an ayin hara on men than on women? Because the man got the curse from at the time of the Nachash HaKadmoni of B'zei Asapecha Tochal Lechem. Is that part of I don't know what, maybe because, there's more competition in the men's market, and we'll forgive the women if they have to support their husbands by producing this wool. We're not going to create an ayin hara, or maybe because she's sending out the knani, and she herself is not selling it in the market. He here is apparently selling it out in the public. I don't know. But there's some sort of an ayin hara. Now, you and I know that within the, let's call it the traditional religious or Hasidic world of Orthodox Jews, which are, there's so many different types and categories. There are some who are very, very concerned about ayin hara. Others, laugh it off. They don't take it seriously. Apparently, at the time of the Gemara, they took it seriously. I don't know if there's still such an entity. My father-in-law, may rest in peace, who died just a few months ago, he was very into this ayin hara business. And I don't know why the red color is somehow against the ayin hara. I'm not sure where that comes from. Maybe some of you know and you can tell me. But I remember when I walked down the chuppah to marry his daughter, he gave me what's called a reiter pendel. And I couldn't reject it. I couldn't refuse it because to him this was so important that this would somehow, he called it akegin. Akegin means it's an anti-force against the ayin hara. Shalta ba'ena. So when we go out into the public eye, we have to worry about ayin hara, especially if we're making a big landing and our profit margin is very great. Maybe it's because somebody else who's not that diligent or doesn't have those particular kishronos, he's not talented in that way, but he's thinking to himself, well, what's this man? Why am I worse than he is? So there's a certain jealousy that he's not out there in the market making such a landing, making such a living. And after all, what's the guy doing? He's taking earth and he's making it into a pot, on selling it at 50. Basically, I don't know. But at the end of the day, I think the Beis Yosef would be inclined in these cases of the woman who is, running around the shuk and the man who's running around the shuk, to assume that this Gemara is more begeder Eitza Tova Kamash Malan to achieve a Siman Bracha. There's no Isser involved. And I say this with a little bit of pain because the previous sugi that we learned about certain periods of time when you're not allowed to be involved in malacha, and if you do, it's ein haro siman bracha. Those periods of time and those mandates, I think, are begeder a davar asur. When we're talking about in one interpretation, Motzei Shabbos, he's already out there doing malacha before he recited Havdalah, and ein haro siman bracha, he thinks he's making a great parnasa from it. And ein haro siman bracha, I would say that there it's more begeder isur, so that at the end of the day, ein haro siman bracha, which is it's the title of our sugya, means different things in different contexts. It's not uniform. It may mean in certain cases an isur, that the minhag created an isur. In other cases, it might be just an Eitza Tova. And you should avoid either having to be so dependent upon a woman who's your wife, who's humiliating herself, so to speak, out there in the market, running around to try to make a couple of piastres, or whether or not you yourself are out there in the market, in the public eye, and engendering an ayin hara. These are not good things. Find alternative solutions to the financial challenges that you're facing. Obviously, you're not going to starve to death if this is the only occupation that you could find. I mean, that's something different. And the Gemara goes on to address other occupations that are out there in the public eye, and somehow they anger the people, out there. The spectators are not happy with it. So Tanrabanan Tagare Simta. All right, so these are people who are middlemen. They buy at a lower, cheaper price and they sell it at a high price. And where are they located? In the simta. Now, the word simta could mean one of two things. Rashi says that it means yoshvim umochrim bashuk. They're mamish out there in the public marketplace. However, and that seems to be the pshat of the Aruch, but the Aruch offers another possibility, that a simta is a side area. In other words, it's a shvil that juts off the public area on the side. You'll see it here in Yerushalayim very often, a simta. but in every city you'll see it. And it's a shvil shel yachid, but it's a mavui hasamuch l'rshus harab. It's very close to the public area, the public thoroughfare. And kolshkein, how much more so would this somehow incur negative feelings if it was mamish in the middle of the shuk in the public thoroughfare? Okay, and then we get to another kind of occupation which somehow gets bad vibes from the people. Megadle behema daka. These are people who raise kvasim v'izim. Okay, we'll have to see why the people are upset with these goats and sheep. Apparently, they make loud noises. Then we have kotzetsei ilonos tovos. They cut down healthy trees. Now, the Mefarshim again want to avoid classifying this as a violation of al tashchis, because if you cut down a tree that's fruit bearing, you violated doraisa. And we're not talking about violating a doraisa. We're talking about eino roa simon bracha and nosnim eineim bechelek yaf. Okay. Now, this last phrase would seem, again, if you disagree with me, that's certainly you're right. I'm just suggesting my impression. This phrase in the Brisa is ola al kulam, and it relates to all the above, meaning we had A, B, and C, and the underlying problem and the negative, recommendation that we're getting in A, B, and C is because of this reason, the underlying reason for all of them, and that's nosnim eineim bechelek yafa. And therefore, eino roa simon bracha liola. So Rashi says the following: Kishacholkim im acherim tamid makpidim litol chelek yafa. In other words, we're dealing with merchandise that's accessible to the public. What do I mean by accessible to the public? He jumped on the bandwagon. He's very he's an entrepreneur. In a free market environment, he took the initiative, which we live in a free market society. So we, in a sense, we praise a person who has that extra energy force. And he, we call Kol HaKodim Zocha. He was the first one to be Zocha. He jumped at the opportunity. There are many people who are vying to get these ilonos, right? These are trees that don't produce fruit. So anyone is allowed, assuming there's no theft involved, to cut down the trees and sell them. And to be a kind of a Bedouin and take care of sheep and goats, also, it's very, very accessible for everyone. And then you have Tagorim, which, they jumped at the opportunity of buying, let's say, volume at a cheaper price and then selling it one by one, item by item at a higher price. And in all these cases, the Brisa avoids the phrase of Sholta Ba'ena. We're not worried, apparently, about Ayin Hara, because we've already seen in the previous Brisa that you took earth, which is worth up this, pardon the phrase, and you made a killing on it, and people are jealous of you and they give you an Ayin Hara. Here, the Brisa omits Ayin Hara. So the impression I get is that this Nosnim Eineim B'Chelik Yafa is a different concept. What is it that Eineim B'Chelik Yafa? Again, Rashi here is Tamid Makpidim Litol Chelik Yafa. Okay, isn't that what a good entrepreneur is all about? Have the choices and grab to the best that you can. This guy has a flock of second-rate sheep or or goats, I'm going to go to the other guy and get a better quality and better value for my money. Isn't that what business is all about? You try to figure out what you can buy on the market and sell at a profit. Buy these trees that are Ilonos Tovos, and you'll probably, when you cut it down into its various, logs and so forth and so on, you'll get a better price for it. So, what is the problem here of Cholkim Einehem Bechelek Yof? The only thing I can come up with is, competition is healthy, but competition also has its negative side to it. Because, if two people are vying to climb the same shvil, to get up to the top of the mountain, then one person inevitably pushes the other one off the high cliff. Like, for example, the Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah that describes the day of Din, and it describes people like sheep who are going up a very narrow path. So one sheep will push the other one in order to get up. The Gemara even has this by the kevesh, that each one of the kohanim wants to be the first to grab on, and one pushes the other one off. We have this vision of extreme competition. And when you get to merchandise that's relatively accessible to any businessman, that creates a very intense competition. Again, it's very hard for us living in a high competition society to see anything but, kol hakavod, as we say. We put on a pedestal he who took the initiative, and others could have had the same profit-making possibility, opportunity, and he was first to jump on the bandwagon and take advantage of the opportunity. So he went ahead and he purchased this merchandise, sold it as a profit. It was very good quality. To our minds, in a very capitalistic society, that's great. That's exactly how we would recommend you making a profit. But if you're the notel, Elek Yofen, then someone else is going to lose, and that's going to... Now, again, I think there's also an element here of publicity. We spoke about a simta, which is either smack in the middle of the public thoroughfare or right off on the side, and you're in the public eye. We're talking about animals that apparently are not only on the hills going down to Maleh Dumim, but maybe he has the animals close to the city, and there's a public nature of it. And certainly if he's selling logs or vertical poles, everyone is aware of this, and the competition is very stiff. Honestly, I would have been happier if the Brisa would have used the term Sholta Ba'ena, and I would have combined the two Brises into one. But the Brisa has Nosnim Eineim B'chelik Yof. Let's just see if we can get a little bit more of a grasp of this sugya in the next line in the Gemara. By time, why is there no Siman Bracha in these cases? And the Gemara says that Tohu Bei Inshi. The word Tohu means Timahon, that people are amazed. But once again, are we talking about Sholta Ba'en? And many of the Farshim say that that's what the Gemara has in mind when it says people are amazed. I'm upset because the text doesn't indicate that there's an issue of Sholta Ba'ena here. But he says the following. This is based on a combination of Rashi and the Meiri. And he says, Anoshim mistaklim al kach b'tima'on. They're wide-eyed. Tagre simta kevin sheyoshim ochrim b'firsum is therefore Rashi and the Meiri both incur the principle of Sholta Ba'ena. So you'll see this in Rashi, Dibra Maskil Tagre Simta. ayin sholetis bahem. Again, I'm not happy with it, but this is what Rashi says, and the Meiri is going to add another element into the equation. Let's just read the next part of Rashi. Megadle be'ema daka hakol tzvachim aleim. Not exactly sure what he means. Hakol tzvachim aleim. It sounds like Rashi is either referring to the noises that are coming from the animals, or maybe everybody's yelling and screaming about the noise of the animals or so. Anyway, the Meiri adds an element here which I think puts this into a different perspective. The Meiri says that Megadlin osam b'yishuv, that these are not animals that are raised out of the city limits, but somehow within the city limits, b'yishuv. The Yeshkan nidnud avera. I think what he means by nidnud avera means he is suspected of an avera. She habehemos mazikos beroos besodos acher. So again, it comes out that it's not an objection to the profession itself. The profession of raising animals is not being rejected. We are shepherds. Isn't that what Klal Yisrael are? That's what B'nai, the Shvatim are. They tell Paro we're shepherds, right? But shepherds outside of the city limits. You're out there in the desert areas. You're out there in the forest areas. That's acceptable. But if you're closer to home, then, according to the Meiri's interpretation, again, I find this difficult to put in Rashi, because the Meiri is completely circumventing the need for ayin hara as an element in this equation. We're talking about nidnud avera. And maybe you try as hard as you can to control the sheep and the goats, but ultimately they're uncontrollable. And if it's in the Yishuv, you've made a bad mistake, because mazikos, they will damage perhaps the gardens or the fields of others around them. Now, if you take a look at Tosas Divrei Maskil Megadla, he quotes the Gemara in Chulin, which seems, according to Rabbeinu Tam, to contradict that Gemara and praise the how should I say, the very lucrative occupation of raising animals. It's very lucrative, and the Gemara says you'll get rich from it. The Amar B'Chulin Arotza She is Aser Yasok B'Behema Daka, and the Gemara quotes a pasuk in Dvarim Perek Dalet. It says Ashtaros, and the Gemara says that those who raise animals, Ashtaros is Miloshan Ashirus, they will get wealthy. The Yeshlomar the Hasam Bicharshin. The Tosas says that an ox, which is an animal that does charisha, and you use it for plowing your fields, farmers will do well in the market. So they need the oxen in order to prepare the field for planting, etc. But Behema Daka, the smaller animals, don't do charisha. So if they don't do charisha, then all you do is you fatten them up for the killing. In other words, they ultimately you shech them. Well, in the case of goats and sheep, you can get their milk for cheese, or perhaps the wool off their backs. There are many different possible occupations, but basically until you're ready for the shearing season, you're not doing much with these animals. They're just eating off the fat of the land. So the Meiri says, take them out to the forests and the fields, but don't leave them in the Yishuv, because you won't be able to control them, and mazikos acherim, and that's a nidnud aver. Then we get to the final case of kotzitze ilonos tovos. And Here he quotes a Kovetz Shitos. I'm not sure who that is. Maybe it's Rabbi Chanan, I don't know. And he says the following, that with regard to Kotzitze Ilonos Tovos, Rashi says, Lemochron li'etzim, Hakol Tmeim Umel'izim Aleim, Umitoch Kach Ein Sholetes Mem B'tzakas B'nei Adam. It's a challenging Rashi. Rashi is always challenging, but this one's a doozy. First of all, what's Tmeim? Unless Tmeim means what we said before, that people are wondering, how did you make such a profit? And then Rashi adds another element into the equation, Mal'izim Alehem. What is that about? Mal'izim sounds like Lashon Las. They accuse them of theft or something along that line. But I don't know, why are these Tagrim any worse than other Tagrim? Everybody who sells something on the market could be, if you want to be very negative about it, you could be Motzi Las. So I don't know what Mal'izim Aleim, what did they do that's so terrible that it's justifiable that people are Motzi Las. But again, maybe you have to take Rashi in the context of Sholetis by and Hara, that once people are jealous of the, significant margin of profit, they'll do anything against this person. They'll libel him and they'll, what's the word I want to use? Motzi Shemra. What's that in English? They'll malign him and they'll accuse him of anything. They'll make up any stories. He's an honest to goodness businessman. He's selling whatever he's selling, and he's raising animals and selling the animals, or shearing, or he's selling logs from a tree. He's an honest to goodness guy, but realize, says Rashi, it's going to incur, because of the public nature, the wrath of the people who are green with envy. When we talk, the last three words in Rashi are very challenging. Tzakas b'nei Adam. Usually, when if you're the victim of theft, like the Gemara has many cases where an almana, a widow, was cheated, and the Gemara says that she is so ekes, she's crying out for justice. If Rashi's borrowing that term from that context, I wonder, again, if you add the Meiri, maybe, somebody's field or garden was damaged by these animals. Again, how's that going to apply to the first and third cases? So he quotes here in the footnote a Kovetz Shitos. He says, Habraisa sha'omra she'ein bozeh siman bracha, and therefore we're not talking about a violation of an Isur, we're just giving him a recommendation. This is not a good occupation for a good Jewish boy. Osekes bilonos srak, she'ein Isur min haTorah l'kotzon, because we mentioned this already before. Aval be'ilon she'oseh peros oseh min haTorah l'kotzon shenemar lo tashchis es eitzah, etc., etc. Kimavur b'Masechta Bava Kama daf Sadi Al. So again, the bottom line is that we're not talking about a violation of an Isur. We're talking about a strong recommendation to go into a different field. Rashi seems to learn, at least in 2 out of the 3 cases, that we're dealing with ayin hara. In the case of Magadli Behemoth Daka, Rashi says everyone's yelling and screaming. The Meiri says because there might be a nidnud avera, and they are mazikos soros acheros. That's what we have. Another 4 occupations that we would try to avoid. Now, there's a discussion here about the word prutos. Apparently, the word prutos indicates that the basic shear of mammon, as far as theft and mechila and replacing, is a pruta. And once it reaches the level of pruta, it would be roy for a siman bracha if it wasn't one of these four prutos. And there's a whole sugi Baba Basra about hanotel pruta me'iyov. That's a whole sugi there about Job. And the person who does business with Job was misbarech. That's before Job was cursed and so forth and so on. Anyway, in the case of Arba Prutos, there's no Siman Bracha. And even if the person who actually gave you the Pruta, as we'll soon see, he had a Siman Bracha, but you receiving the Pruta will not have experience a Siman Bracha. Okay. The Chassam Sofer is bothered by the extra word li'olam, and he wonders what the word li'olam means in this context. And he has two possibilities, and he rejects one of them. If he goes into one of these four occupations, what happens if he sells out? A lot of people will sell their business. And one possibility that the word li'olam means that even when he sells his business and he gets X amount of money for selling it, he will not benefit from that money. There's no siman bracha. That's the more extreme application of the word li'olam. The other explanation is, no, I'm sorry, that's the less extreme, the more minimal interpretation of li'olam. The maximum interpretation of li'olam means that even if he opens up other businesses, he will not profit from other businesses because he took the prutos from this business. And the Chassam Sofer rejects that. He says li'olam means from this occupation, and if he sells it from the money that he gets from this occupation, he won't see a siman bracha. That's li'olam. But we're not putting a whammy on this guy as if to say that any business he goes into, he's just he'll be a loser. That's not li'olam. Now, the Pella here, I will say, is the first of the four. Kosmin, schar kosmin. Who are these kosmin? These are the scribes who write Sifrei Torah, mizuzas, tefillin, and they sell them. Now, some of my best friends are scribes. I don't know what to do with this Gemara. But for some reason, the Brisa is guaranteeing that a scribe, and he could be great at what he does, and you and I know there are different levels of scribes. My grandsons learned in a yeshiva in the old city where they teach the boys, I'm talking about young boys, how to be scribes because they want to make sure that the boys will have some parnasa. But apparently it's not a great income. And we'll have to see why. And the Gemara is going to tell us an unbelievable thing that Chazal put a whammy on these scribes that they shouldn't get wealthy because if they do, they'll go into early retirement. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu guarantees that they shouldn't make too much profit, so they'll continue to write ad me'av yesru. Anyway, then we have schar miturgaman. Now the miturgaman was the person who would stand in front of the Chacham on Shabbos and Yontif, would listen carefully to what the Chacham whispered into his ear, and then he would project his voice so that the tzibur could hear it. Hence the word Amora. So these were the Miturgamon. And there are many, many complicated halachas about the Miturgamon. In Ayin Ramam Hilchas Talmud Torah, he goes into nuances. The Turgamon has to wait until the Rebbe finishes, and he can't raise his voice, he can't lower his voice. And is he allowed to take questions? When is he allowed to take questions from the audience? I mean, a million halachas on the Miturgamon. But it's not a good business to go to. And the Gemara is going to compare it to schar Shabbos, when you make your money from an occupation on Shabbos. Schar Yisomim. Okay, this is very complicated. And honestly, I can't figure this Gemara out. You have to know a lot of Gemaras and Shas. Apparently, what happened was there was a Yasom and he inherited whatever he inherited. And there was an individual who was, I guess, a good entrepreneur, and he would offer his services to make a profit by selling, the fruits of the fields of the Yisomim, and he would take 50% profit, and the other 50% was given to the Yisomim. Anyway, we'll have to see why this is not a good profession to go into. And finally, Mos Habot Mimedinas Hayam. The Gemara is going to explain that when a person sends his boats all the way to the other end of the earth on the deep, the seven seas, there's something that's not so great about making a profit from that. And the Gemara is going to explain why. Bishlei Maschar Miturgamon. Out of the four that are listed here, I understand the second of the four. Bishum de Mechse Kischar Shabbos. Please underline the word Mechse. Otherwise, if it wasn't Mechse, then you'd be in violation of a real Isa. We're assuming now, like the Beis Yosef's conclusion, that Eino Roa Siman Bracha means it's not a recommended field to go into, but there's no violation of an Isa. If it was Schar Shabbos, then you're not allowed to get money for Schar Shabbos. You pay me for the work that I do on Shabbos. That's an Isa for me to accept that money. But here, it's Michse Kischar Shabbos. And the Mefarshim emphasize that these are Miturgaman who work 7 days a week, and not only working on Shabbos, but the main profession is on Shabbos, because that's when we need the Miturgaman desperately. We read the Torah publicly, the Chacham of the city gives his drasha publicly, and the bulk of his salary check is being paid to him for Schar Shabbos. He gets a minor payment for what he does during the week. So this is called Havlah. And technically, according to the strict letter of the law, he's allowed to be paid for what he does on Shabbos because it's included in what he does during the week. But in the eyes of the people, my father, Olav Shalom, was a Rav of a shul. And he got salary, whatever he got, was not, you wouldn't get rich from it, but it was enough to, Baruch Hashem, be mefarnes the family. And every Uncle Beryl in the community had eyes, and knew exactly what were the conditions of his occupation. The man gives a drush on Shabbos, right? That, okay, my father was a pretty good darshan. Many rabbis would call on him desperately on Erev Shabbos. Rabbi Berzon, give me a drush, But, okay, you're a great darshan, that's wonderful. But for that, we're going to pay you, $20,000 a year, which was a lot of money in that time. And everyone's, wondering about it. I mean, my father was pretty busy the rest of the week too. But they thought, he's being paid for his Shabbos sabbatical service. Now, Mos Yisomim Nami, and I told you before that I don't understand the sugya. You have to know a lot of Gemaras here, especially in Masechet Pesachim about these Mos Yisomim Schar Yisomim. But the Gemara says, Lav b'nei mechila ninhu. The reason why this person who's buying and selling the merchandise, the possessions of the orphans, is not going to have a siman bracha from it is because when he takes his profit from the sale, Lamazog, and he takes 50% profit, he may be taking more than he should be taking. And the Yisomim in this case don't know what's flying. They're young children, Ebuch, and even if they're mature enough to know, halachically, until they reach a certain age, their mechila is not a valid legal mechila. So he's left with a situation where, had they been adults, maybe he could have told them why he took the profit that he took, and they would be mochel him because they don't want to get involved in selling on the open market. They have other things. They're doctors and lawyers and whatever they are. And they're willing to be mochel. Let him take 50%. Others take 40%. He's a good guy. He does a good job. But in the case of Yisomim, they are too young to be in the parsha of Mechila, and therefore there may be an issue of gzeil. Okay, but mos habos mimedina sayam. Well, what's the problem with taking your merchandise across the seas in the ships and selling it? I mean, this week's parsha we'll read in 2 or 3 days. Zvulun al chof yamim yishkon. He's going to make a pragmatia from selling his goods. What vasishlem? Mishum de lav kol yom misrachish nisa. Pile ploy. The Gemara is talking about the danger element, which is a subject that is so relevant today that we live in the coronavirus situation. Every Wednesday in the afternoon, I mean, this is not a pitch, but if you take it as such, I'm okay with that. I give a Zoom cheer for the Canadians and some Israelis that join me about corona issues. And it's all about the same issue. Even the cheer that I prepared for today, it's all about exposing yourself to danger, because we know the corona is dangerous. Exactly what level of danger is a subject of poskim. The poskim deal with this. There are people who packed out of the big city areas and they went down to, I don't know, Eilat or whatever they went to, where they hope that they're not exposed to this disease. And the question is whether that's okay or not. It's all about levels of sakana. And doing business out in the seas, especially in those days, was very, very dangerous. Every 6 months, you embark on another trip to another area, to get to West Indies, to buy the trinkets or the gold or the jewelry, whatever you're buying. You come back, and another 6 months later, you're on the seas over there, and it's always very dangerous. Truth is, in our day, there are other dangers besides corona. I mean, even traveling, through the streets of a city could be very dangerous. Again, I always like to quote my father-in-law. He used to say Tfil Saderech in New York every time he got into the car. I don't know if Al Pidin you're supposed to, but that's what his minhag was. Because it's dangerous. Crossing the street is dangerous, especially here outside of Har Nof. I don't know if you know what's going on here. The whole street for Kanfei Nisharim for miles. It's a total wreck. 2 days ago, I had to go out. I ended up in the middle of a street. I just didn't know where to turn. It's bonkers. So there are all sorts of types of sakana. But in the day of the Talmud, the most dangerous preoccupation, and it was very lucrative, again, unless you got attacked by the pirates, or you got a storm out sea, was going out and shipping and, import-export business. Even today, I mean, there's a community in Israel, a Sephardic community, that in America, I should say, they make a tremendous amount of money, but they don't go out in the ships. But in those days, you went out in the ships. There's local yom misrachish nisa. You can't expect a miracle to happen on a regular basis. Yordei Ayama, one of the 4 cases of Birchas HaGomel. It was very, very dangerous in those times. People wonder whether airplanes, really come under that category. I remember Rav Soloveitchik vacillating about this issue when he used to fly back and forth from Boston to New York on a weekly basis. At the end of the day, I think he decided not to bench Goldman. He didn't consider, even though I think, if I'm not mistaken, the plane goes out over the Atlantic and then it swings back to New York. But nevertheless, he came to the conclusion that it's not a sakon. In any event, Elaschar Kosvin, my timer, what's wrong with scribes? I mean, they deserve to be paid for what they do. They supply us with tefillin, mezuzahs, and Sifrei Torah. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, Esrim v'arba tinios, 24 tinios. The Ben Ish Chai wonders about the significance of the number 24. It's not coincidental. Yashvu Anshe Knesses Agdola al Kosvei Sfarim Tefillin Mezuzahs Shelo Yis Ashru. The hairstyle, Maisa. The Anshe Knesses Agdola. These are the holy rollers. They would fast 24 fasts to guarantee that the Sofrim would not make too much of a profit. It sounds like an attractive, lucrative profession. And they had to counter, this is not a laissez-faire capitalist society. And why? Shil mole mis ashrim, because if the scribes would get wealthy and we need them so desperately, we'll pay anything. I remember many, many years ago, I bought a Megillus Esther for $500. At that time, it was a steal. But you could pay thousands of dollars, even for a Megillah, for a Sefer Torah today. I don't know, 30,000, 50,000. I don't know what they're charging it. So it's a lucrative business. No, because the Anshe Knesset Agdola are praying that they don't get wealthy because ilmole mis ashrim ein kosv. If they get wealthy, they're going to go into early retirement. We need them desperately. And therefore, we are not going to sit by idly while they make a killing in the market because they're selling Sifrei Torah, etc., at a high profit margin. The Ben Ish Chai wonders about the number 24 here, and he says it corresponds, of course, I don't even have to tell you this, to the 24 Kisvei HaKodesh, the 24 holy books of Tanakh. And he says that if these Sofrim are writing the various books of Tanakh, then we have to fast with that very same number so that they won't achieve their goal of writing the entire Tanakh. I get the impression, by the way, for the Ben Ish Chai, the Ben Yoyada, that he understood that back in the time of the Talmud, they would pay people to write all the books of the Tanakh. And there are people today who will commission a scribe to write all the books of Tanakh, or every single book of the Tanakh. And that is something that we need. Now, the next line in the Gemara, Torah Rabbanan Kosvei Sfarim Tfilim Mezuzos Hein V'Tagreihem, is Eino Roa Siman Bracha. The second brisa adds Tagreihem. So it works like this. Like we have up the block here a geschäft called Oter Yisrael. I don't know if you heard of it. Anyway, one of the many centers for selling and buying and selling Sifrei Torah, mezuzahs, tefillin, and so forth. So they have professional sellers who stand in the front. They'll show you all the various options if you want to buy a Megillah, for example. And the Sofrim are one flight up. They don't get involved in the actual business of buying and selling. Why is it that the Tagrim, those who are on the front selling, why are they subject to this this whammy, if you will, that Eino Roa Siman Broch? So this is the kasha of the Ben Yoyod, and he writes, Masechet Gozos Sofrim Shelo Yisasru, move on. That I can understand. Even to Yisasru Lo Yichtavu, and so forth. It's not worth it for them once they get wealthy to continue the very tedious, time-consuming, and we don't realize how much work goes into writing Sfarim. Aval Tagrim, Madua Shelo Yisasru, Harei Elu Gamim Yisasru, in Yisashru, I should read it. Yamshichu lavod ba'avodasa. V'tirei shetagorim v'tagrei tagreim heim ha'tagorim taholchim layoros merukakos kedei limkar sifrei Torah tefillin mezuzahs vehu terach gadol. It's not like the Oter Yisrael here where you'll see the tagorim right there in the window shop. But these are tagorim who travel all around to sell the merchandise. V'yis ashru lo yatrichu. If once they get wealthy, it's not worth it for them to put in all that effort. Lo leches and komos harachokim. And therefore, nimtza she'elu nimtzah mikos harachokim lo yelehem sifrei Torah tefillin umezuzahs. So if you're in a far out land, you won't find the availability of these sfarim. The od im yisashru hatagorim yasu bistam kiminig mashem osim biotre peros sheiknu harbe tefillin mezuzahs v'anichum biotzar kedei sheyimkru yoser biyoker. He says the following: that once the tagorim get wealthy, they can buy storehouses, storage houses. I meant to say, otzros, and that brings them a tremendous profit, because when you buy in bulk, then as we know from the law of economics, you sell it at a profit, each individual item. So they'll buy Sfarim in bulk. They'll tell us, so for look, for the next 10 years, all your Sfarim are mine, all your tefillin are mine. And they'll take all these pairs of tefillin, these mezuzahs, the parchments of mezuzahs, which they just store, and then they'll sell it at a great profit. As a result, the people have to suffer and they have to pay a higher price. And rather, so this would mean that they would force to make a living, eke out a living. They got a hold of a sefer. They had to find a buyer for it immediately. They weren't able to hold on to it and sell it at a higher price. Now, before we end the shir, which we'll spend another 5 minutes, I did a little bit of research on the previous Gemara, and the Mishnah at the beginning of our chapter opens with a minhag not to do malacha. In some places, they accept this minhag during the morning of the 14th. And the Gemara was medayik that after Chatzos, in the afternoon of the 14th, that was clearly, unquestionably awesome. So much so that the Gemara didn't understand what's the difference between Erev Pesach and Erev Yontif or Erev Shabbos in general, where we don't allow malacha. And then the Gemara says, well, that's not a real violation, and it's only Ein Haro Simon Bracha, etc. So what's the nature and the reason for this Easter after Chatzos to occupy yourself with malacha on the 14th of Nisan? And I was familiar with Tosfos at the very beginning of our perek, who quotes the Yerushalmi, who says that biyom shemevi karban asur b'asiyas malacha, then on a day that you're obligated to bring a karban, you're enjoined from doing malacha. And in the case of Erev Pesach after Chatzos, we're all enjoined to bring a karban Pesach. So it's a day of karban for everyone. Hence, we are prohibited in malacha. That's what Tosfos says in the name of the Yerushalmi. So that's the Easter after Chatzos, which doesn't depend upon minhag. But I want to quote to you two Rishonim, the Ritva and the Ran, who understood Rashi as arguing against Tosfos. Again, the later Achronim, the Slach, the Sfas Emes, they disagree with the Ritva's take on Rashi, but that doesn't make any difference to me. The Ritva understood Rashi in the following way: the Iser Malacha Mechatzos, who mishum shelo yishkach levayer es chemtzo, v'lishchot es pischo, uletaken matzah leleil pesach. In a word, this is a time period to get involved in preparing mitzvahs. There is a very intense obligation at this period of time. You can collapse it into this half a day and make sure that you are panim min hamalacha, so that you will have all your time free to dedicate to these mitzvahs. So I would like to make two comments. Comment number one is that I doubt if the Ritva's take on Rashi would generate an Issa Doraisa. The Yerushalmi derives its conclusion from a Yalfusa, that on a day of a karban you are enjoined from malacha. Second comment is, would there be an Isur malacha today after the Churban Abayis? He quotes in a later paragraph, pages down the line, the Balamar, who says that Bisman said that we don't have a karban Pesach, we are not enjoined from doing malacha on Erev Pesach after Chatzos, based on the Yerushalmi, who says that the Isur malacha after Chatzos is because of his involvement in the karban. That doesn't apply today. If, on the other hand, you're talking about tikkun hamatzos or getting rid of your chametz, that applies today no less than it did back in the day when the Mikdash stood. So I'm suggesting two fundamental differences here between Rashi and Tosas. Rashi, I mean the Ritva's understanding of Rashi. One nafkamina is whether we're dealing after Chatzos on Yudal the Doraisa or just E'ar Chaka Darbanan. And the second nafkamina is whether or not this Isur applies is Manazeh. But he goes ahead and quotes the Tzlach and the Sfas Emes, and they understood Rashi in a different way. That Rashi is talking about a minog shalolasos malacha kodem chatzos. Not that Rashi is talking about malacha after chatzos. After chatzos, Rashi would agree with Tosfos based on the Yerushalmi. It's a yom karma. Rashi was only interpreting before chatzos. What motivated the minog to abstain from malacha before chatzos on Yudal? And that's the involvement in these mitzvos. But after chatzos, Rashi is on the same page as Tosas in the name of the Yerushalmi. And then it means that all the Rishonim are splitting between the first half of Yudalid and the second half of Yudalid. First half of Yudalid is a Drabanan because he's Torah b'malacha and he'll ignore the other mitzvos that he has to be occupied with. The second half of the day from Chatzos and on, we're dealing with the Doraisa, and we're dealing with an Isur because of the Korban Pesach. I'll just end with the Pnei Yoshua. The Pnei Yoshua has an amazing chiddush in this sugi. And he says that the minog of abstaining from halacha before chatzos was an extension of the Isur malacha after chatzos. And he writes, Lo matzinu yom shemiktsaso asur umiktsaso mutar. We cannot split the 12 hours of daylight into two parts. And he even goes so far as mentioning a Gemara later, which we don't know about Beit Shammai, that we should abstain from halacha even on the night going into Yudal. Why is that so? He's not involved in destroying his chametz. He's not involved in preparing his matzahs. The answer is, says the Pnei Yoshua, because it's a din of lo matzinu yom shemiktsaso asur b'malacha miktsaso mutar b'halacha. That puts this sugya into an entirely different perspective. We're talking about hilchos manim, and we're talking about a minog to engender kedushas hazman. Now you'll ask me, what's the precedent? Who says that a minog has the ability to engender kedushas hazman? Bishleim after chatzos, that's a doraisa halacha because it's a yom karban. But the first day, because lo matzinu miksaso, that's a drabanan. The answer, I believe, is Yontif Sheni Shel Golis. In Yontif Sheni Shel Golis, the Gemara says minag avoseinu b'yadeinu, and Yontif Sheni has the same identical kedushas hayom as Yontif Rishon, albeit drabanan mishum minag. But we do have the power and the authority with minhag to engender kedushas hayom. So let's just make a note of where we got up to today. We're here on Daf Nun Amid Beis, and we're up to Tanur Rabbanon, Kosvei, Tefillin, Umezuzos. Everyone, a great day. Thank you so much.